I know I said the True Crime and Paranormal Podcast Festival was going to be my last event this year, but that turned out not to be true. I got an invite I just could not turn down from my friend Josh Hallmark. He is the host of True Crime Bullshit, and he is opening a studio called Studio Both and he is hosting an amazing launch party. It is going to be October 14th, 2023. It is going to have live shows, special guests, a studio tour, and a premiere of his new podcast, Unsafe Spaces. It's being held in North Adams, Massachusetts, and there is more information in the show notes. But to give you an idea of some of the podcasts that will be there, we have the Karen and Ellen Letters, Generation Y, Already Gone, True Crime Cases with Lainey, Murder She Told, Defense Diaries, Navigating Advocacy, and more. There will be the premiere of Unsafe Spaces along with a Q&A. The Karen and Ellen Letters are performing live, and then there is going to be a True Crime live show that I will be a part of, and I would love to see you there. If you want tickets or more information, it is in the show notes. So again, October 14th in the Berkshires. If you've ever wanted to be in the Northeast in the fall, this is your chance. Beautiful location, beautiful time of the year, and an amazing event. All profits are going to charity, so check the show notes for, again, information and a link to buy tickets. When Cher Elder disappeared, the police learned that she was last seen with a man with a violent past. But when that past was not allowed in at trial and jury deliberations stalled, some wondered if the law was getting in the way of justice. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crime Lines. Welcome to Crime Lines. Welcome back if you've listened before. We are back to our usual schedule of 3 episodes a month in the regular feed and then bonus content on Patreon and Apple subscriptions. August is always kind of a rough month. I need to just learn to start taking more of it off ahead of time. We are on our regular schedule until December, which is when we will have 12 daily episodes for the 12 days of Crime Lines. But if that's not enough content, remember to check out Crime Lines and Consequences, which is my other podcast. This month, Eric and I will have an episode on incels with Dr. Shiloh and Dr. Scott from the LA Not So Confidential podcast. And it's just so wild, all the research that has been done into incels, the incel movement, when that will turn over into violent crime. And it's a really interesting discussion. But before you go check out Crime Lines and Consequences, let's get into today's case. You can do that after this episode is over. This case was recommended by Jean, so thank you for suggesting it. All of my sources are linked in the show notes, but a major source was the work of Steve Jackson with Westward, as he covered this case in a series of long-form articles. He also has a book out on the case called Monster, and while I didn't use the book directly, the research from the book and the articles can't exactly be separated, so I've left a link to the book in the show notes as well. I am going to give a content warning, which I don't normally do, but this case does involve serial sexual assaults. One will get a bit graphic. You know if you're in the headspace to listen right now, or if you need to save this episode for another time, or just skip it altogether. I completely understand. So let's go ahead and get started with Cher Elder. Cher was born to Rhonda and Earl in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, which is a resort town northwest of Aspen. Her parents split up when Cher was just a toddler, and her mother, Rhonda, told Steve Jackson of Westward that Cher was a happy child, but she was kind of needy when it came to attention, and she thought that probably came from bouncing between her parents' homes, both in Colorado and then later in Missouri. She had spent her early years out in Grand Junction, which is practically in Utah, but by high school, Cher ended up moving to Purdy, Missouri, which is a small town about an hour from Joplin. Purdy would be an unheard of little Midwest town, if not for their school district's policy against dancing. Yes, very footloose here. They have a policy against school dances. This school district is basically just 2 or 3 schools, and since the late 19th century, the largely fundamentalist Christian population has opted to ban school dances. In the 1980s, a group of parents and students sued the school district saying that they were violating the separation of church and state by banning activities at the school based on religious grounds. The parents initially won in district court, so in 1988, the kids got to have a homecoming dance. But then the appellate court overturned the ruling, saying that the school board could make their own policies. Then it was appealed to the Supreme Court, where they declined to hear the case. So the dance ban stayed in place, but the reason I bring this up is because Cher Elder was 17 and a student at Purdy High School when this ban was reinstated, and articles were being published about it. Cher was quoted in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in September of 1989 as saying that she didn't know what the big deal was. You can't get pregnant through dancing. She was later in a photograph in a national news magazine also reporting on the situation, and these are the types of things I like to find in the archives. People's lives often, here on Crime Lines, get reduced to the murder case I'm going to talk about, oftentimes because there is little else out there about them. So when I find reporting on other things in their lives, I like to take a minute to remember them as they were in that moment. Like Cher, sitting in a restaurant with her friends, as a reporter asked them how they felt about the dance ban. These moments give some of the humanity back to these people. Now, though school-sponsored dances were still banned, private proms still occurred, so Cher and the maybe 36 students she graduated with still got to have that very typical high school moment. After graduating from high school, Cher moved back to Colorado with her family, and she lived in the Denver, Colorado area near her father, Earl. She took a job as a server at a hotel restaurant while she figured out what she wanted to do next with her life. In the spring of 1993, when she was 20, Cher had found her footing. She was dating a guy she really liked, Byron Powers, and had recently enrolled in Barnes Business College. She had all of her books and supplies bought and ready to go. On March 28th, days before classes were supposed to start, Cher went over to her boyfriend Byron's home. When she got there, she found that her boyfriend was not there alone. He was there with another woman, and Byron didn't seem to care that much. It seemed that Cher's perception of the seriousness of their relationship was a lot different than Byron's. They had been together just a few months, and Byron was definitely the bad boy type. We'll get into how bad later, but Cher had really fallen for him, and this was a huge blow to her. Even worse, after she arrived, Byron and the other woman went out drinking together. Left behind at Byron's place was Cher and a man named Tom Luther, who was a friend of Byron's stepfather. He was quite a bit older than Cher, 35 years to her 20, and his friendship with Byron's father started while they were in prison together, which Cher likely didn't know the details about. Not wanting to sit around and feel bad for herself, Cher wanted to go to Central City to see her friend. Central City, for those who are not aware, is a gambling town. So if you say you want to go to Central City, you are probably going to one of their 5 or 6 casinos. Tom was willing to go with her and even offered to drive, so Cher left her car behind in the parking lot and rode with Tom to the casino where Cher's friend worked. Cher's friend did confirm she saw her with Tom that night, but that was the last confirmed sighting of Cher. When no one heard from her for the next 2 days, her father reported her missing. Now, Cher's car was also missing, and her belongings looked untouched. Even her school supplies were where she left them, ready for the first day. A check of her bank records showed no activity since she was last seen. In talking with Cher's friends, the police learned that her friend who worked at the casino in Central City had seen her there with a man, but this friend didn't know who this man was. However, casinos have security cameras everywhere, even in the 1990s, so they were able to confirm that Cher was with a man, and the police now knew what he looked like. And they knew Cher left with him around 1:40 in the morning. The investigators eventually interviewed Byron, Cher's boyfriend, though he denied the title of boyfriend. He said they were basically friends with benefits, and that Cher did get upset that night when he left with someone he characterized as his new girlfriend. Byron said he didn't know where Cher went after he left his home, and she wasn't there when he got back. He and his girlfriend went to bed, and at some point, Cher came back into the apartment and said goodbye before leaving again. Byron said he later found 2 notes in his apartment from Cher. One was chastising him a bit, saying something like, "Now you know why I haven't been in a relationship for 4 years." And the other said, "Call me, we'll talk." But he didn't call her, and he hadn't heard from her. Byron was shown the CCTV from the casino and asked if he knew who the man with Cher was, and Byron said he didn't know, never met him in his life, which was a lie. After a little more conversation, Byron claimed Cher had actually said something about going to Central City to see a drug dealer, which was also a lie, and it seemed designed to throw the police in a different direction. But it didn't work because that story didn't make a lot of sense to the investigators based on the work they had already done up to that point. There had already been a rumor they heard that Cher was a police informant and that her disappearance was related to that. But the investigators knew she wasn't an informant, and the more they looked, the more they realized she couldn't have been one because she didn't know anything. Yes, she was hanging around Byron, who was hardly a Boy Scout, but she wasn't involved in that life. Hours after the investigators had wrapped their interview with Byron, Tom Luther called the police, saying that he knew they wanted to talk to him. The investigators at that point had no idea who he was. It turned out that after talking to the police, Byron called Tom to let him know that they had that security footage of him with Cher the night she went missing. Knowing it was just a matter of time before the investigators figured out who he was, Tom called to get ahead of it. The investigators headed out to talk to Tom at his home. He readily admitted that he had been with Cher, though he called her Sherry at that point for some reason. He said that after they left the casino, they drove to a parking spot in the mountains, and in an attempt to get back at Byron for being with another woman, Cher had sex with Tom, though she immediately regretted it, so much so that she vomited in his car. Tom brought her back to Byron's, which is where her car was parked. He heard her then say goodbye to Byron, though he said that she actually said something more like, "See ya, kiss my butt," rather than the goodbye that Byron remembered, and then Cher left in her car. Unfortunately, this area where Byron's apartment was did not have cameras, so they could not confirm that Cher ever came back for her car. Tom admitted that he had heard Cher was missing even before he spoke to Byron that day, but he had hesitated to come forward with his information because of his past, which is fair enough. Tom had been released from prison just 10 weeks before Cher went missing, and he had been in there for 10 years after being convicted of a brutal rape. So let's go ahead and back up to 1982 to talk about the crime that got Tom Luther behind bars. Tom was about 25 years old at the time and living in the Silverthorne area, working as an occasional taxi driver and occasionally a carpenter. A 23-year-old woman who we will call May, not her real name, had taken the bus from Denver to Frisco, Colorado on February 13th, 1982. She and some friends were staying nearby in Silverthorne for a ski vacation. May's bus wasn't just the last one leaving town that night, it was also running behind schedule. So she didn't get to Frisco until about 2:15 in the morning. She was alone since her friends had already left earlier in the day. May would have gone with them, but she still had to work. When she got to the bus station, her friends were not there to meet her, possibly because the bus had been running so late. May was trying to figure out how to get where she needed to go. She couldn't find the paper with the phone number for the place they were staying, and she wasn't sure the exact address. While she was standing there, Tom Luther pulled up in a pickup truck and offered both May and the other people who got off the bus a ride. He said he was an off-duty cab driver and saw them all just waiting in the cold. The other people were staying close enough to the station that they opted to walk, and May did hesitate to take the ride from a stranger. But Tom was disarming, and she had few other options at 2 a.m. Though May didn't have the exact address, she did have an idea of where the house was, so they decided to drive over to the neighborhood to see if they could find it. It was a property owned by one of her friend's parents. They drove around for a while and couldn't find the place, so May suggested they go to the police station. She could talk to them, maybe give them the name of the owners, and the police could then look up where the house was. But then Tom suggested they try one more neighborhood first. Now this is where it's about to get graphic, so feel free to hit that fast forward button at least one time to get past it if you want to. Tom drove down the street and then pulled the truck over and ordered May to take off her clothing. Knowing what was about to happen, May tried to get out of the truck, but Tom punched her and overpowered her. May fought back hard, trying to stop him from raping her. Tom, in this attack, was unable to get an erection, so instead, he penetrated May with the handle of a hammer while he was also physically assaulting her. Tom came close to killing May, both strangling and beating her with his hands and also with the hammer. Eventually, the attack stopped, and Tom started the truck up. He pulled forward a bit before he stopped again and ordered May out into the cold. He told her to take her things with her. May reached in the back of the truck to get her weekend bag before she fled the area as quickly as she could. She walked until she found a house, she knocked on the door, and the people were able to call for help. May was transported to the hospital for treatment and in the process gave the police a description of the truck and the man who attacked her. Her memory of the truck was not precise given that it was dark and she had just experienced this horrific trauma, but it still didn't take long for the police to find it. As patrols were driving around looking for it, they saw a pickup with a bloody handprint on the window. And regardless of the accuracy of May's description, this was pretty obviously the truck. They approached it and looked in to see what they could see in plain view. They saw even more blood, so they made entry into the home where the truck was parked. And as soon as they saw Tom Luther, they knew he was the guy. He had scratches on his face and blood on him. In his bedroom, they found more bloody clothes. While Tom later denied saying this, the arresting officer said that while on the way to jail to be booked, Tom said he didn't know why he does, quote, these things. Tom was charged with attempted murder, sexual assault, and assault. And then while waiting on trial, an inmate came forward and said that Tom was looking for someone to kill May so she couldn't testify against him. The police wired the inmate up and he was able to get Tom to repeat the request on tape. They then tacked on another charge related to that threat. After a failed attempt at an insanity case, he was claiming May reminded him of his abusive mother, which is very Freudian of him. Tom ended up pleading out. In June of 1983, Tom admitted that he was guilty of first-degree and second-degree sexual assault, with the other charges being dropped. He was given a 15-year sentence and served 10 of those years behind bars. He told the investigators looking into Cher Elder's disappearance all about it, including that the police set him up and lied about him confessing. The police questioning turned to Byron and if Tom thought he could have been involved. Tom said it was unlikely, and Cher was probably just laying low with some drug dealer. According to Tom, who had only met her for the first time that night, Cher had a major cocaine addiction. Nothing in the investigation indicated that was remotely true, but the police kept getting this. The people who seemed closest to the case, Tom and Byron especially, kept putting out this idea that this must have been drug-related. It was early on that the investigators saw this for what it was: deflection. About 3 weeks after Cher's disappearance, her car was found a few blocks away from Byron's apartment. It didn't yield much evidence, but it did mark the end of the hope that Cher had just taken off out of town on her own for some reason. Even if she brought nothing else with her, she would have taken her car. As the investigation continued, things kept pointing towards Tom Luther as the last person to see Cher alive. And with his violent past, he made for an obvious suspect. We've already talked about his conviction in the attack on May, but now is as good a time as any to get into the rest of who Tom Luther was. To start with, he was born in the late 1950s in a small town in Vermont, and that is pretty vague since Vermont is mostly made up of small towns. Tom was from Hardwick, which is just an hour south of the Canadian border. As a child, Tom was abused by his mother, including suffering a head injury from reportedly being thrown into a stove. His father would intervene when he saw his wife abusing his son, but his method of intervention was to then beat his wife for beating his son. So violence in the home was solved through more violence. According to Tom's self-report, he was also sexually abused by 2 people by the time he was 13. One was an adult male, and the other was a female relative. By the time he was around that same age, 13, he was already drinking and using drugs. He was sent to live with relatives, but didn't make it far into his first year of high school before he dropped out. Tom's father then died when he was 17, and a few years later, Tom up and moved to Colorado in 1978. According to Steve Jackson, the reporter who did a lot of work on this case, Tom Luther only had 1 juvenile criminal mischief offense. Now, given the violence of his attack on May at the age of 25, I would have expected to see earlier violent offenses. It's possible he hadn't been caught, or it wasn't reported. So at the time of Cher's disappearance, Tom had 1 conviction for a brutal rape, but he was also a suspect in 2 Colorado murders. Just 5 weeks before the attack on May, in early January 1982, 2 women were murdered on the same night. There are so many details in these cases that we could do one long episode on those, but let's go ahead and at least do an overview now. Annette Schnee was living alone in Colorado, having moved out there by herself, and she worked at various resorts and tourist spots. And I know these are tourist spots because I've been a tourist to pretty much all of them. Breckenridge, Frisco, Keystone, places like that. If you remember, Frisco is where May's bus dropped her off while she was staying in Silverthorne. These are all spots about 30 minutes away from each other. Annette had 2 jobs, one in Frisco and then one in Breckenridge. After a shift in Frisco ended on January 6th, 1982, she got a ride with friends to Breckenridge. She stopped at a pharmacy there and then left around 4:30 p.m. Her usual routine would suggest that she was heading home to Blue River to eat and change before her 8 p.m. shift, which would bring her back up to Breckenridge. She never showed up to her shift at the bar, and when the police later checked her home, they found her uniform was there. So it's believed she went missing between the pharmacy and Blue River, likely hitchhiking, as she often did so to get around since she did not have a car. That same night, Bobby Joe Oberholzer called her husband between 6:30 and 7:30 to let him know she was on her way home from Breckenridge, which is where she worked. The 2 only had 1 vehicle, which Jeff needed to get around for work, so as usual, Bobby Joe was hitchhiking back. Bobby Joe lived south of Blue River in Alma, so she was leaving from the same town as Annette and heading in the same direction. While it was an assumption that Annette had been hitchhiking that day, we do know Bobby Joe was, because a friend saw her and offered her a ride. However, he was not going far enough south, and Bobby Joe was afraid she'd get stuck halfway home in a small town without much chance of getting a ride the rest of the way home. She wanted to wait for a ride that would get her all the way down to Alma. However, Bobby Joe never made it home. Her husband Jeff was obviously worried, and he and friends set out the next day, January 7th, to search for her. It was around 3 p.m. that day that they found Bobby Joe's body about 300 feet from a small parking area just 4 or 5 miles north of her home. Her body was at the bottom of an embankment, and she had been shot at close range. Based on the evidence, the investigators believed Bobby Joe had gotten out of a vehicle and fled her attacker. As she ran to find somewhere to hide, the man shot her. She kept running and fell down the embankment when he shot her again. Blood evidence indicated that she tried to climb back up before losing her strength and sliding down to the bottom. Bobby Joe's keyring was found in the parking area, and there was also an orange sock found, which did not belong to Bobby Joe. On the 7th, the same day Bobby Joe's body was found, Annette didn't report to work again and was reported missing. Though Annette's body was not found as soon as Bobby Joe's had been, the two cases were almost immediately linked due to the fact that they were two women both hitchhiking south from Breckenridge on the same day. What were the odds that two different killers were picking up hitchhikers from there on that day? It was 6 months before Annette's body would be found in a creek by an 11-year-old. She had also been shot, and her backpack, like Bobby Joe's backpack, was also missing. But what really linked the two cases was the orange socks she was wearing. She was only wearing one, and the perfect match to it had been found in the parking lot near Bobby Joe's body. It was theorized that this mystery man had killed Annette, with her sock being left in his vehicle. When Bobby Joe later got out of the same vehicle to flee this killer, the sock fell out and left the clue that linked the two cases definitively. Due to Tom Luther attacking May in the same basic area after offering her a ride 5 weeks after these murders, he was near the top of the suspect list. The main difference between the attacks was that Tom had attacked May with a hammer, not a gun. Had she died, it probably would have been by strangulation or blunt force trauma. But there were inmates who claimed that Tom did confess while in prison to having killed 2 women in Breckenridge. Tom repeatedly denied it, though he had little reason to confess to the police. He had a 15-year sentence. If he admitted he killed 2 women, he would never get out of prison. Tom was a suspect, but he wasn't the only suspect. A witness came forward and told the police that she had seen Annette in Bobby Joe's husband's vehicle weeks before the murders, and later, Jeff's business card was found in Annette's discarded belongings when they were found. So the husband of one victim apparently knew the other victim. But when he was asked if he knew Annette, Jeff initially said no. To give some context, though, which is always important, he was asked if he knew her by name, and he said no. But when he was shown her picture, he immediately admitted that he did recognize her. He had picked her up one day when she was hitchhiking through town, and he just didn't know her name. Jeff did have an alibi, though some of the investigators thought it was a little too vague. He was home for much of the day, and he had friends around who could alibi him for chunks of time. Jeff was cleared from suspicion, and later, thanks to DNA, Tom Luther was also cleared. His DNA did not match the male DNA found on Bobby Joe's glove. The DNA led the police instead to Alan Lee Phillips, who was convicted in both murders in 2022. But at the time Tom was locked up for the attack on May, he was a suspect, and Alan Phillips was not even on the police radar. And it was while Tom was in prison for that attack on May that he met a woman named Deborah. She worked as a nurse at a hospital in Pueblo, Colorado, and this was a state-run hospital that inmates would be taken to for medical care. One day in 1990, Deborah was at work and she saw a sign outside a door that said no women were allowed in without a guard. Deborah was both a registered nurse and held a degree in psychology, so she was curious about who they had in that room that was so dangerous she couldn't go in there alone. Curiosity and maybe a little recklessness led her into that room where she met Tom Luther. After this brief meeting, Deborah started writing to Tom in prison and occasionally visited him. She was under the impression he was in prison for assault, which was true, but Tom neglected to mention that it was a violent sexual assault and a near murder. When Deborah did find that out, it didn't seem to dissuade her from interacting with Tom. She believed he had changed and deserved a second chance, so Deborah started campaigning for Tom's early release, writing letters to the judge and even hiring a psychologist to evaluate him in 1992. Unfortunately, that evaluation did not go exactly the way Deborah had hoped. Tom openly talked about his rape fantasies with the psychologist, which wasn't very reassuring given that he was in prison for raping someone. Tom also said he thought he and Deborah could have a good relationship after he got out, since she had expectations of him, which many didn't. In the end, the psychologist diagnosed Tom with borderline personality disorder with features of sexual sadism and noted his history of violence. He did not recommend Tom's release without serious supervision. Mind you, while Deborah was trying to get this man out of prison, Tom was also busy picking fights with others, talking back to guards, and he even told Deborah how he got kicked out of the sex offenders program in prison because he made threats against the counselor. This was the changed man Deborah was lobbying for. And the gross part is that it worked. In spite of everything indicating it was a bad idea, Tom was given early release. He was supposed to get out on Christmas Day 1992, but he flipped out one day and ended up being put in solitary, so he didn't get out for another week and a half. And as anticipated, Tom began his relationship with Deborah in earnest the day he got out of prison, in spite of the fact Deborah was married with 2 kids. In fact, her husband had helped Tom by writing a letter to the judge on his behalf. And then less than 3 months after his release, Cher Elder disappeared, having last been seen with Tom Luther. Deborah was questioned by the police after Cher's disappearance, and they kind of hoped she was the weak link who might turn on him. Deborah was an educated woman, a registered nurse, and a mother. She wasn't the criminal sort, so she might be the easiest to rattle. But Deborah stuck with the story that Tom had told her, the first story he told her, and it was the same one he told the police. He took Cher back to Byron's place, safe and sound. Deborah added that she had heard someone saw Cher after that point at a bingo parlor, which the police already knew was not true. Cher's case remained open and active all summer without any major breaks until it looked like there was a potential to get a witness to turn on Tom Luther. In September of that year, Cher's boyfriend Byron was arrested for attempted murder. There was some hope that maybe Byron could be persuaded to give over some information about what happened to Cher in exchange for reduced charges. He was only 23 years old, and he was facing decades in prison if he was convicted. There was good reason the investigators believed Byron knew something. Not only had he covered for Tom by denying that he knew him when he was shown the casino footage, he also claimed Cher said goodbye to him after she returned from the casino. So if Tom did something to Cher after they left Central City, it sounded like Byron knew it and agreed to tell the story about her making it back to his home safely in order to cover it up. When Byron was approached about this, he decided to attempt to play it slick. He teased out some information, denying he knew anything directly, but rather that he had heard Cher was killed for being a police informant, and he believed Tom and another guy may have helped bury her body. He would give more specific information in exchange for no prison time. Byron was being charged with attempted murder, so there was no conceivable way he was going to walk with no prison time, no matter how much information he had. The deal went nowhere, and Byron went to trial. He was convicted and ended up with 3 consecutive 8-year sentences. He was not going to get out of prison until he was in his 40s. Then in the spring of 1994, a year after Cher disappeared, Tom left the state. He had gotten pulled over in Colorado shortly before he left, and it seemed like he was just trying to get away from the police scrutiny on him. He wanted to go somewhere where he wasn't known as a suspect in the disappearance of a 20-year-old. Tom roamed a bit before eventually settling in West Virginia, near where his sister lived. Deborah decided to leave her family in Colorado to move with Tom, but only moving to be closer to him. Tom did not want her to move in with him, so she lived out of her van at a campsite and got a job nearby. Tom was hot and cold with his interest in Deborah, and she did not appreciate this. She was in love and, in her view, had done so much for him, and he often seemed not to care. For the 4th of July, 1994 in West Virginia, Tom hosted a backyard cookout that he did not invite Deborah to. Angry and rejected, she then reported to the state police that Tom Luther had guns on his property, which he did, and that he was a suspect in a murder case in Colorado. Getting Tom on police radar was something Deborah did when she was upset with him. When he had gotten pulled over shortly before leaving Colorado, that was because of a tip Deborah gave the police. So this wasn't new behavior. The police in West Virginia were definitely curious about Deborah's accusation, so they got the information on Tom from Colorado. They made a note to keep an eye on him, but at that point, there really wasn't anything they could do about him living there. And since the police didn't make contact, Tom didn't know that Deborah had alerted the police to his presence, and the on-again, off-again relationship continued into August. Then one day, in August of 1994, Tom was giving 2 people a ride, a man and a woman. We're going to call the woman Bethany, which is not her real name. After dropping the man off, Tom drove Bethany to a field where he physically and sexually assaulted her. This attack was brutal, breaking Bethany's jaw and shoulder. After the attack, Tom initially told her he was going to drop her off at the hospital and then said he was instead going to take her to his home. Knowing that she was not safe going to yet another location with this man, Bethany bailed from the car when he stopped at an intersection and she ran. Rather than trying to chase her down, Tom took off in his car, trying to just put distance between him and his victim. That night, Tom packed up his car and left town. He stopped at his sister's house first and confessed to having beaten up a woman, but claimed it was done during a drug deal. Tom was gone for a few days before he came back to West Virginia, and the police had Bethany, his victim, call him while they recorded the call. They wanted to get him to make admissions so it would be more than just her word against his in court. Bethany called on the pretense of needing to get her keys back, saying she dropped them in his car. She then asked him why he raped her. Tom replied that he didn't know, it wasn't a fun thing, and then he apologized. With this confession to a rape on tape, Tom was arrested and charged again. In early 1995, he was convicted and given a 15 to 35-year sentence. Investigators in Colorado had hoped the trial in West Virginia would have brought out some information to help them find Cher, but it did not. So they decided to take another shot at Byron, Cher's boyfriend. At this point, he had been sitting in jail for a few months, and they hoped the reality of his situation might warm him up to a more reasonable deal. They couldn't let him out of prison, but maybe he'd be willing to negotiate a lighter sentence. And not to mention the fact that Tom Luther was now in prison in another state and unable to retaliate against anyone who snitched on him. And this plan worked, not just with Byron, but with an ex-inmate friend of Tom's named Dennis. It turned out they both knew where Cher Elder's body was, and the important thing was that their information was independent of each other, which helped verify each other's stories. Dennis said that Tom had killed Cher and said he needed his help. So while Tom buried Cher's body, Dennis acted as a lookout. That's how he knew where they could find her. As for Byron, he said that he had followed Tom one night when Tom went out to check on the spot to make sure it hadn't been disturbed during any searches or by any animal activity. So Byron told them where to go to look for the body, and it was the same place that Dennis had said. Separately, they led the police to the same spot about 30 minutes west of the casino where Cher was last seen. So a month after Tom's conviction for the rape of Bethany, Cher's body was found buried under a pile of rocks in Empire, Colorado. She had been shot 3 times in the back of her head. 37-year-old Tom Luther was then indicted in March 1995 for first-degree murder. Tom's arrest for Cher's murder made the papers, obviously, and one woman named Heather saw the article while she was waiting on a counseling appointment. She saw a picture of Tom Luther and recognized him as the man who had attacked her 2 years before. Now, I am using Heather's name because she wrote a book about her journey of healing, and it is called A Drop of Rain by Heather Smith Callahan, if you are interested in reading it. To give you an idea about how bad the attack on Heather was, know that the police began investigating it as a homicide while she was still alive, because no one expected her to live. It was April of 1993, not long after Cher went missing. Heather was selling her car to pay back an ex-boyfriend for a loan. A man called and said he was interested in seeing the car as soon as possible. So Heather let her neighbor Rebecca know that a man was coming by to look at the car just as a heads up for safety reasons, which was smart. The man, who Heather recognized in the newspaper 2 years later as Tom Luther, checked out the car and then asked if he could look in the hatchback. While they were back there, after Heather opened it, he struck her from behind. Heather immediately thought he was trying to knock her out and get her into the back of the car. So she screamed for Rebecca, who thankfully heard her. The attacker continued to hit Heather until she was on the ground. Heather yelled for Rebecca to call 911, and as she called, the attacker fled. Rebecca then ran to Heather to try to put pressure on her wounds, but there was just so much blood. When the paramedics arrived, they rushed Heather to the hospital, already doubtful she could survive the amount of blood she had already lost. The man, Tom Luther, hadn't been hitting her, which is what it felt like to Heather. He had actually been stabbing her. He had cut an artery, punctured a lung, and cut into her liver. Emergency surgery was attempted, but it was clear the surgery itself would kill her if they continued. In the ICU, Heather's family and friends were told to say their goodbyes. But then Heather was still hanging in there the next morning. And then she regained consciousness, and though she was incredibly weakened by the loss of blood, she was strong enough for surgery. Heather was still expected to remain in the hospital for months, but she ended up well enough to go home with support after 8 days. And on day 9, she was in the police station, giving her statement and providing information for a police sketch of her attacker. But it wouldn't be until Heather saw his picture in the paper and called the police that Tom would be charged with this assault. However, the first trial was going to be for the murder of Cher Elder. And this was a death penalty case. The state saw Tom as a violent and dangerous man, and if the death penalty was for anyone, surely it was for a serial offender like Tom Luther. The defense, however, won some major pre-trial battles, including, and especially, the exclusion of Tom's previous conviction in the attack on May, and the exclusion of the conviction from after Cher's murder related to the West Virginia attack on Bethany. The state could not tell the jury that this man was a serial attacker of women, which was a big part of their first-degree murder case. They had to prove that Cher's murder was premeditated, and what would show that more than his pattern of attacking women? However, it was not allowed in. The trial started in January of 1996, and Cher's family attended. Her mother's coworkers had donated their unused vacation days so that she could attend every day without worrying about losing pay. And that's one of those impacts we don't think about that families have to bear. It's not like jobs offer paid time off due to a lengthy trial. Families have to use vacation time and sick days or go without pay to sit in that trial. And it's not like the trial is easy itself. Cher's family had to sit there and hear gory details, like learning Tom Luther had cut off Cher's finger to steal a ring. So imagine having to do that while also worrying about paying your bills that month. Thankfully, her coworkers helped cover her. Now, there were a number of witnesses who went over much of what we've already covered, but I do want to mention just one of them, and that is Byron. Byron was a key witness in many ways, as he knew where Cher's body had been buried and claimed that Tom threatened to frame Byron for the murder using that ring he had taken from her. So Byron was important to the state. However, Byron was, along with Dennis, the defense's reasonable alternative suspects. So he was also important to the defense, and both sides were eager to get him on the stand and get their theory of the crime out. That was until Byron almost caused a mistrial. During direct examination, Byron was asked how he knew Tom Luther. He had already been told he could not bring up anything about Tom's criminal past, but instead of saying, "I met him through my stepfather," which would have been sufficient, Byron said he had been his stepfather's cellmate in prison. And in that moment, the jury learned Tom Luther had a criminal past, something that had been excluded by the judge. The defense asked for a mistrial, and the judge opted to take the night to consider it. The next morning, the judge instructed the jury to forget what they heard because they couldn't assume just because someone was convicted of a crime one time in their lives that they were guilty in every other case. And I think the real deciding factor for the judge in this was what Byron didn't say. He didn't say what Tom had been in prison for. It could have been for a non-violent, unrelated crime, and I think the jury would have even likely assumed that. After all, if it was for a similar crime, they probably would have assumed they would have been told about it. So the trial continued with the state showing that Tom Luther was guilty and the defense contending that Byron and Dennis, the two people who knew where the body was, were the actual perpetrators. The jury took the case to deliberate, and it seems that they all believed Tom was guilty. But was he guilty of first-degree or second-degree murder? After nearly 8 hours of deliberation, 11 of the 12 voted for first-degree murder. The 12th juror, however, continued to vote for second-degree. They asked her why she believed it wasn't first-degree, and she refused to speak to them. When they pushed her, she said if they didn't leave her alone, she would vote for an acquittal. Later on, an anonymous caller to the prosecutor's office claimed that this juror had gone to her priest during the trial and was advised to do whatever she had to protect Tom from a possible death sentence. Of course, this was improper if it did happen, since jurors were told not to discuss the trial with anyone. But it confirmed what the other jurors had suspected. Since she was unwilling to even discuss or explain her reasoning, many of them thought it was the death penalty that kept her from going with first-degree murder. And this is why I hope to never sit on a jury for a death penalty case. I doubt I'd get chosen due to my stance against the death penalty anyway. The state would not want me on the jury. And it's not clear from what I read whether or not this juror said she was anti-death penalty or not during jury selection. Or, if the anonymous caller was telling the truth, the juror was influenced by clergy during the trial, which, like I said, is against the rules. But this anonymous call did not happen until the trial was over, and this juror nearly caused a mistrial by having a hung jury, even though everyone agreed he was guilty. But Colorado has a special rule in place for situations like this called the Lewis instruction. I haven't found many details about the specific case this rule came out of, but I did find an appellate judgment which gives it some context. In 1981, Patricia Lewis killed her husband, Tom Lewis Sr. It appears Patricia initially claimed insanity, but she was found sane, and after that, there was a jury trial in September 1982. The jury agreed on guilt, but disagreed on the degree of the crime in a split of 9-3. The judge essentially instructed the jury that if someone is guilty of a higher crime like deliberate murder, the lesser included offenses were also things she could have been guilty of. So basically, if they were split on which guilty verdict to go with, they needed to choose the lesser one because it fit with everyone's view of the crime, at least mostly. So after days of the jury in the Cher Elder case being stuck between first and second degree murder, the judge pulled out the decade-old Lewis instruction. The one holdout juror got the verdict she wanted, guilty of second degree murder, leaving the 11 other jurors very angry and apologetic to Cher's family. Later, when the jury found out that the real extent of Tom Luther's past had been withheld from them, especially that he had a history of violence against women, they were even more upset. That information may have been the piece to have turned the 12th juror towards first-degree murder. After sentencing, the judge gave Tom the maximum allowed under the law, which was 48 years, which would be served after he finished his sentence in West Virginia. But he wouldn't be sent back to West Virginia just yet. His trial in the attack on Heather was still pending. After Tom waived his right to a jury of his peers, a bench trial was held with Heather as the key witness. Because she had fought to remain conscious during her attack and quickly rattled off information to the paramedics in the ambulance as they thought she was dying, there were plenty of details presented, and no doubt that Heather was able to identify the man who attacked her. The judge found Tom guilty of both attempted murder and assault. And here's something that's really surprising to me. The judge sentenced him to 50 years in prison, which meant Tom Luther got 2 more years for trying to kill Heather than he got for actually killing Cher. But it was the conviction in Cher's case that made that possible. Because he had been convicted in the attack on May in the 1980s and then Cher's murder, Tom qualified for a sentence enhancement due to being a habitual offender. And the question of how habitual of an offender he was continues to this day, 30 years later. Tom Luther was jailed for attacking May and sent away for 10 years. He was out of prison for 2.5 months before he killed Cher, and then a month after that, he attacked Heather. It was 16 months later before he was caught again, this time for the attack on Bethany. A few people came forward over the years saying that Tom claimed he couldn't control himself. So was it possible there were other victims he couldn't or wouldn't control himself around? There's a big focus on the time after Cher's murder when Tom was no longer in Colorado, as he became a bit transient during that time. His girlfriend Deborah told the police that he would leave for days at a time and come back tired, sore, and sometimes injured, like he had been doing manual labor. There are some vague suspicions out there, like how sometime in the fall of 1993, Tom was seen in his hometown in Vermont with a blonde female hitchhiker. He told his friends that she left the state, and the next day, he also left town. But there are suspicions on some more specific cases, like the 1994 disappearance of 21-year-old Karen Denise Wells. According to the Charlie Project, Denise lived in Oklahoma, but had driven north to visit her friend Melissa in New Jersey. She was traveling along I-78 and was about 4 or 5 hours away from her friend's house when she decided to stop for a few hours to rest. Something that is odd is that Denise had actually made it past this point by about an hour, but then doubled back for some reason to stop in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It has not been made public if she knew anyone in the area. Denise called Melissa around 7 and said she was going to get McDonald's and then take a nap before doing the last leg of the drive. Melissa offered to head to Carlisle to meet her there. So Denise went down to the front desk of the motel around 8 p.m. and asked where the nearest McDonald's was. She was given directions and then she left, presumably to go eat. But when Melissa showed up at the motel after midnight, Denise didn't answer the door. Melissa got the front desk clerk to let her in, but Denise wasn't in there. They did find in the room all of Denise's things, and strangely, that included the hotel key. For some reason, she didn't bring it with her. They checked the parking lot, and the car she was driving wasn't there. Several hours later, at 5:30 in the morning, Denise's car was found about 35 miles north of the motel. The car was out of gas and the doors were left open, draining the battery with the interior lights being on all night. There was road trip related trash in the car, like empty soda bottles, a map, and a bag from a Hardee's restaurant. There's also some pot found, and Denise's change purse was found in a nearby ditch with a small amount of cash in it. The car Denise was driving was a rental, so the police had a starting odometer reading from the company to compare against the suspected path Denise took from Oklahoma until she reached Carlisle, and there were about 600 to 700 miles unaccounted for. Denise remains missing, but it is notable that the rental car was found just 5 miles from where a body of an unidentified woman had been found just 4 months before. This woman, this Jane Doe, was known in the area and had been seen hitchhiking around. However, unfortunately, no one knew her name, and she remains a Jane Doe. We know killers sometimes return to the same dumping spot, so is it possible Denise's body is in that area, and these two cases are possibly connected? That is one of many questions in this case, but for the sake of this episode, we need to look at how this connects back to Tom Luther. According to Steve Jackson's incredible research into this case, we know that Tom Luther was in that area in Pennsylvania working both in the winter of 1993, when the Jane Doe was found, and in the spring of 1994, when Denise went missing. The police have not named Tom as a suspect in Denise's disappearance. They do have some suspicions about people closer to Denise who they believe haven't told them everything they know. But Tom Luther is, of course, worth looking into. And if people do decide to start looking into unsolved cases and Jane Does that could connect back to Tom Luther, like people have done with other serial killers like Ed Edwards and Israel Keyes, just remember to check in with yourself and your confirmation bias to try to avoid connecting dots that really don't connect. In the meantime, Tom Luther remains in prison. He is currently incarcerated in Colorado, and he will be eligible for parole in 2081 when he is 124 years old. Thank you for listening. You can find Crime Lines on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and occasionally TikTok. Crime Lines is on Patreon, where I offer early and ad-free episodes as well as bonus content. Visit patreon.com/crimelines. If you want to buy me a coffee, the official drink of Crime Lines, you can give a one-time donation at basementfortproductions.com/support. And if you need a palate cleanser after listening to heavier true crime shows, check out Rusty Hinges, an allegedly funny history, mystery, and true crime show that I co-created and write for.